Hello and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today. We do have a great show for you. We're going to be talking to attorney Richard Roth, who is representing some plaintiffs in a case that is regarding Julian Assange. It's actually visitors that went to go visit Julian Assange. It turns out they were spied on by the CIA and Mike Pompeo, and he's got some stunning developments regarding that case. He's going to be talking to us tonight. But we do want to get to this first story here. John Mearsheimer, you may remember him. He's one of the best known analysts of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. He's the University of Chicago political science professor, also West Point grad who served in the military as an Air Force officer. He's the one who gave the talk about why Ukraine is the West's fault, which he gave 7 years ago. He talked about NATO expansion being a thorn in Russia's side and warned that there could be a war if the West continued down that path, which he ended up being very accurate. And that talk has been seen now over 30 million times. Well, 2 weeks ago, he gave another speech for the nonprofit committee for the Republic. And I want to go over it with you because it's really important. So this time he talks about the current state of the war and how it's going to end. In fact, he gives the lead in as to what his talk's about. Let's go ahead and play that.
There are three basic questions on the table about Ukraine. The first is what caused the war? Number two is what's the state of the war today? Where are we at the moment? And then the third question is what is likely to happen moving forward? And I don't want to talk about the causes of the war. I may say a few words in the conclusion, but I'm not going to talk about the causes of the war. I want to focus mainly on where this train is headed. But to talk about where the train is headed, it's important to talk about where we are today first, and then segue in to talking about the future. And I'm going to make two arguments. The first argument is that there's no chance of a meaningful peace agreement. There may be at some point in a distant future a ceasefire, and that will then turn into a frozen conflict. But the chances of resolving this in any meaningful way are remarkably small, in my opinion. And then my second argument is that the Russians are going to win the war. They're not going to win a decisive victory, but they're going to end up conquering a huge chunk of Ukrainian territory beyond what they already have. And they're going to take Ukraine and make sure it remains a dysfunctional rump state.
Okay, so these are the points that he's going to talk about in this. He does touch a little bit on how we got to this point. Of course, he doesn't cover it in depth because he's already done that. 30 million people watched it. But he does touch on it a little bit. This is what he has to say.
Here, the United States was really in the driver's seat to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And that strategy or policy, of course, included NATO expansion, EU expansion, and turning Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy. Those three policies packaged together were all designed, again, to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. The Russians made it unequivocally clear from 2008 forward that this was unacceptable and that it was not going to happen. And they made it clear that they would destroy Ukraine as a functioning society before they would let it happen.
Okay, so very much making it clear. Now, he goes into, when he breaks down sort of what is going on now, before he gets to the actual war, he's going to go in and explain the actual battlefield at one point. But prior to that, he's talking about the existential threat and the goals of each of the players involved in the war. And those players involved are obviously Ukraine, Russia, and then there's the West. And the West can be sort of broken into the United States, which is the main player for the West. But then the European countries are also sort of minor players, even though they're very much right there in Europe, but they're still sort of minor players in the entire grand scheme of things. So he starts off first by talking about how the goals of these various different players oftentimes will result in an existential threat to another one of the players. So here he is. He's going to talk about the United States' goals in this war, in this conflict, and how these goals by the United States are an existential threat to Russia. Watch this.
Once the war starts, the United States has to stipulate what its goals are vis-a-vis Russia. And we have made it clear that our goal is to defeat the Russian military in Ukraine, to wreck its economy, and to, in effect, knock it out of the ranks of the great powers. There's also all sorts of rhetoric coming from the West and people in the administration, right, that make the argument that we should go beyond that and that we should pursue regime change. Then we should put Putin on trial. And there's even lots of talk these days about breaking apart Russia the way the Soviet Union broke apart in December 1991. This is the second layer of the existential threat. So there's no question that the Russians see themselves facing an existential threat. And I might add here that I have a number of friends who argue that the Russians are not facing an existential threat. My response to them is very simple. It doesn't matter whether you think they're facing an existential threat. The only thing that matters is whether they think they're facing an existential threat.
Okay, so he breaks that down. There's two reasons why Russia feels like they're having an existential threat. And that is the first, which is the NATO expansion, which is what he's talked about in the past and also touched on briefly, which was that the goal is to make Ukraine a Western bulwark right on Russia's borders. That's an existential threat. The second existential threat is wrecking its economy, knocking out of the ranks of the great powers, potentially regime change, potentially breaking Russia up. That these are all existential threats to Russia. So that is why they're pursuing what they're pursuing. Now he's going to talk about Russia's goals in this entire thing and who that's an existential threat to. Here's that.
Now, a lot of people think that the Russians are bent and have been bent since February 22nd, it's February 24th, 2022, in conquering all of Ukraine and in absorbing it into a greater Russia. The Russians have never been interested in that, and they're not going to try to do that. What the Russians are interested in doing is capturing a substantial portion of Ukraine and also making Ukraine a dysfunctional rump state. They have already formally annexed 4 oblasts plus the Crimea. And they have made it clear they have no intention of giving that territory up. I might add here that they don't control all 4 of those oblasts completely at this point in time. But those 4 oblasts plus Crimea make up 23% of Ukraine's territory. I also believe that they will take the 4 oblasts that are immediately to the west of those 4 oblasts. And this includes Odessa and Kharkiv. And once they do that, they will control 46% of Ukrainian territory.
So he goes on to say, controlling 46% of Ukraine's territory is obviously an existential threat to Ukraine. So the United States' goals are an existential threat to Russia. Russia's goals in this war of taking much of that eastern land from Ukraine, the Russian native speakers, is obviously an existential threat to Ukraine. He goes on also to talk about in this that Russia is not going to expand. Some people believe that Russia is going to expand and try to take all of Ukraine. He says that's not something that they want to do. They don't want to swallow a porcupine. He says that that many people in the western part of Ukraine they speak Ukrainian, they're very much nationalistically Ukrainian, and they hate Russians. And so there's no reason why Russia would want to take over a region that hates them so fiercely and will constantly give them headaches. On the other hand, they could take the Russian territories that are mostly filled with ethnic Russians speaking Russian, and those people are not going to be resistant to being under the rule of Russia at that point. To them, it's like Ukraine or Russia, okay. So saying that that's going to be ultimately their goal. Nonetheless, that's still 46% of Ukraine's territory, so that would be an existential threat to Ukraine. Now, if Ukraine also feels, and again, as he says, it doesn't really matter if you think Russia's facing an existential threat or not, as long as they think they are, that's the only thing that matters. Same thing for Ukraine. It doesn't matter if they're not actually facing an existential threat that Russia's just going to come in and take the Russian speaking and leave the rest of Ukraine. What matters is if Ukraine believes they're going to take all of Ukraine, that's an existential threat. But in reality, if Russia's goal is to just demolish Ukraine, to make it a rump state, obviously this is an existential threat to Ukraine, right? So that's pretty obvious. Okay, so he does talk about now Europe's goals and the threat. So this is kind of the minor when it comes to NATO. NATO, United States is the major, Europe is sort of the minor in it. So this is what he says about Europe's goals and threat.
But I would argue that virtually every country in Europe depends for its security on NATO. This is not talked about much in the West, but the fact is that deep down, European leaders completely understand that NATO provides security for them. It's their security umbrella. And the great fear here is that if we lose in Ukraine, it will do significant damage, maybe even destroy the alliance. And therefore, people are deeply committed to making sure that that doesn't happen. And I sense that is, in effect, an existential threat.
He also mentions in his speech China, and he says that one of the existential threats that NATO and the West, and the United States in particular, might feel is that China's a bigger threat to the United States. And because of that, losing this war would showcase weakness that they don't want to showcase in the face of China. So that's one point he brings up. Now he's going to talk about Ukraine's existential threat, which I think is pretty obvious. Here it is.
Let me say a few words about the Ukrainians now. Their threat environment. They view the Russians as an existential threat. This is really a no-brainer. Given what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, it's clear that Ukrainians think they are.
Yeah. Obviously, Ukraine is experiencing an existential threat. And I don't think anybody should minimize that or ignore that Ukrainians, and we'll get into it, he talks a little bit about what's happening on the battlefield, and it is pretty atrocious what is happening. This is ultimately a proxy war between the West, United States really more fundamentally, and Russia, and Ukraine is really sort of stuck in the middle of all this. And what is happening to them is it's really, truly horrendous. So now he is going to talk about the battlefield. He's going to talk about what type of war this is, where we're at on the battlefield, and who's winning the war and who's going to win the war. Watch this.
Now, let me say a few words about the battlefield. It's very important to understand that this is a war of attrition. The basic goal of each side is to bleed the other side white. This is not a war of maneuver. There are no blitzkriegs here. This is Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali standing toe-to-toe and beating the hell out of each other. This is a battle like World War I, fights at Verdun, at the Somme, and so forth and so on. It's a classic war of attrition.
So he goes on to talk about what is needed to win a war of attrition, that these two are just pummeling each other at this point, and you need three things to win a battle like this. First, you need resolve, population, and then you need artillery. So when he talks about resolve, he says there's really no meaningful difference between the two. They both have the same level of resolve. Obviously, Ukraine has the resolve to try to remain a sovereign country, not to be turned into a rump state, not to be broken up in half. That is Ukraine's motivation. That's their resolve. So they have the resolve to stick this through because they don't want to end up being just a rump state. Russia has the resolve to see this through because they view this as an existential crisis as well, as an existential threat. They don't want a Western bulwark on their borders. They don't want nukes on their borders aimed at them. They view Ukraine as their little brother. They've viewed them this forever, Ukraine and Belarus for that matter. And they're basically beating the snot out of their little brother for even challenging them. That's ultimately the way they're feeling about it. They're saying, how dare you? You're a traitor to the family if you're courting these people over here that have made it clear that they do not like us, they want to challenge us, they want to break us up, they want regime change, they don't want Russia to exist, and you're playing to them, you're dating them, you're trying to marry them. We're going to make sure you can't even do that. So he says the resolve is no different for either side. They're both going to see this through to the end, whatever that end is. Population, he goes through the population of the two, and he says, going into the war, Ukraine had far less people than the Russians. It was about three Ukrainians to every 5 Russians in the battle. Now they're saying it's 5 to 1. So sorry, it was 3 to 1, and now it's 5 to 1 because there's been a lot of refugees. A lot of people have fled. So now people are leaving Ukraine. There's 8 million who have left the country, mostly men who fled. 3 million of those have gone to Russia, of those refugees. So now looking at the population, the demographics of this war, there are 5 Russians to 1 Ukrainian. So it's not on their side. The population is just not on their side. He also mentions during this, before we get to the artillery, and I'll let him explain that in a clip, but he mentions that in 2022, Ukraine had the upper hand in this battle, and they were kind of on the winning side of this. And that's often the case when you're invading another country. If you invade another country and it's their home turf, you don't have home court advantage, right? So he said Ukraine had the upper hand in all of 2022, most of 2022, but now Russia has the upper hand. It is 2023. He says that Ukraine has been preparing for this counteroffensive, which they're in the middle of doing right now. We're not seeing much. Even pro-Ukrainian analysts are looking at the current counteroffensive saying, it's not so great. It's pretty weak. And he said, Ukraine didn't even really want to do the counteroffensive. They're sort of being shoved into it by the West. They're being forced to do it. They don't really want to do it because they know that they're just being pummeled on the battlefield. So then he goes into artillery, and he says, really, artillery is the determining factor of who is going to win the war. Now, remember, this is a West Point grad. He says that this is the type of stuff they learned when they were learning military strategy, is that artillery is the key. And this is what he says about the artillery difference between the two countries.
Then we come to the artillery imbalance. Almost all of the reports on that balance say the number is either 5 to 1, 7 to 1, or maybe 10 to 1 in the Russians' favor. This has massive consequences. Massive consequences. You just want to think about what this war is all about. It's 2 armies standing toe to toe, trying to kill each other with massive amounts of firepower. And one side has a 5 to 1 or a 7 to 1 or a 10 to 1 advantage. The side that's on the lower end of that ratio is in the deep kimchi. This is really horrendous. And by the way, that country that's on the downside of that ratio in artillery also is on the downside in the population ratio.
So this is why he says Russia's going to ultimately win this. It's not going to be, and he's going to get into the ending of this, whether there's going to be a peace agreement or how this is going to end. He's going to talk about that. But this is why he's saying Russia's ultimately going to win. They've got a population advantage over Ukraine. They have an artillery advantage over Ukraine, and they have the same resolve as Ukraine. So they're not going to back down. They're going to win this thing, and that's that. He then goes on and talks about, I want to play this next clip for you because I think it's really important to understand the death and destruction that's happening on the battlefield and how desperate Ukraine is on this. So watch this. It's very, to me, this makes me pretty emotional. We'll go ahead and watch this.
It's quite clear that Ukraine is engaged from their point of view, in a total war. They have mobilized their entire society. They have soldiers who are as old as all of us out there fighting. They have old dogs and young dogs, lots of untrained people. It's because they're desperate. It's because they're desperate.
That to me right there, listen, and he's totally right. Russia's just sent in certain groups to fight this. They haven't even mobilized their entire military on this, and they're certainly not sending in untrained civilians into Ukraine. There's been some chatter about untrained prisoners that they sent in or whatnot, but for the most part, they have not mobilized their society. Ukraine is completely mobilized. This country is desperate. They're throwing old men at this war. Civilians, untrained people are in this war. And this right here is why I get very frustrated with, though I have agreed with John Mearsheimer from the very beginning as to why this war has happened, the expansion of NATO. This is very much the West's fault, poking the bear with Russia, constantly aggravating them, getting them to this point, which is really, truly one of the faults of the United States. And they should do everything, our government should do everything that it can to put an end to this war, to seek a peace agreement, to back off from Ukraine, but they refuse to. They're just going all in. And the people of Ukraine are the ones who suffer. It's the people who suffer. And to think about old men, I couldn't even imagine my father, for example, being thrown into this war in order to potentially push back Russia turning the nation into a rump state, or to have untrained people being thrown into this war. That desperation is incredibly sad and horrible. And anybody who champions what Russia is doing, I have a very, I don't agree that Russia's doing the right thing by doing this. I don't think there's any war where there's the right thing, these are the good guys, and the good guys are going in and acting like Russia's a hero in this. People are being murdered, massacred. People who are civilians, people who are just given a gun for the first time and sent on the battlefield. That should make all of us sick. And it should make us sick that not only are the Russians doing this in order to just make an example out of Ukraine and to say, how dare you try to marry the West? I understand their anger, but I understand how the West got them into this. But we can't root for this sort of death. We shouldn't at least root for this sort of destruction. I came from, the reason my family is here in the United States is because there was a war in Vietnam where it was brother against brother. And literally in my family, I had an uncle serving on one side and an uncle on the other. It was brother against brother. And it is sickening. It's totally and completely sickening. And neither side ever feels like they're the bad guy. Every side thinks they're the good guy in the entire conflict. And the reality is the bad guy in this is the United States government and NATO that is continuing to push Ukraine, poke the bear of Russia, and throwing old men, young men, untrained people into this battle. This should make everyone completely sick. Now, where is this ending? What is going to happen? This is what Mearsheimer has to say about that.
Now, let me conclude by talking about the possibility of peace agreement. Not going to be a peace agreement, meaningful peace agreement. Not going to happen. You'll get a frozen conflict. Why is there not going to be a meaningful peace agreement? Two main reasons. The first is the territory problem. The Ukrainians want their territory back. The Russians have made it clear they're not going to get their territory back. The Russians are not going to give up those 4 oblasts they annexed. They're not going to give up Crimea. And the Ukrainians insist on getting that back. Zelensky told Xi exactly this. There'll be no peace agreement until we get all our territory back. And the Russians are going to end up taking more territory. And they're not going to give that back either. How do you square that circle? Second big problem is the neutrality problem. The Russians insist that Ukraine be neutral. Right? They've insisted this from the beginning, and their argument is if Ukraine can't be neutral, they're going to wreck it. They're going to wreck it to keep it out of NATO, or if it's in NATO, it'll be ineffective because it's wrecked. Right? The Ukrainians, on the other hand, They don't want neutrality. The Ukrainians, for completely understandable reasons, want a security guarantee from someone. Well, the question of who is that someone? The only someone out there is the United States or the West or NATO. And that's not going to happen, right? That's not going to happen in ways that will please the Russians. The Russians will not accept that. So how do you square that circle, right? You don't. Two other quick problems here. One is the hyper-nationalism problem. There's a lot of nationalism in the air before this war started. It's morphed into hyper-nationalism, which means the hatred on both sides is off the charts. It's going to make a peace agreement very difficult. And then the other problem is that a number of leaders have made it clear that they lied to Putin about their commitment to the Minsk agreement. You remember the Minsk agreement, which was formulated in late 2015, was designed to shut down the conflict in the Donbass. And Putin was deeply committed to making the Minsk agreement work because he did not want to invade Ukraine. Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, Petro Poroshenko, and Zelensky himself have all said they never had any interest in making Minsk work, and all they were doing was buying time to build up Ukraine so it would be in a better position to fight Russia. Trust, there's no trust on the Russian side because of this. So you see, you have a problem involving territory, a problem involving neutrality, hyper-nationalism, and zero trust. You're not going to get a meaningful peace agreement. You're going to get a frozen conflict. Let me conclude by just very briefly saying that what's remarkable about this case is that there were a significant number of people in the United States who argued that expanding NATO was going to lead to disaster. It included people like George Kennan. It included people like the actual Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, and the actual chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Clinton administration, saying this was a disaster in the making. It included people like Paul Nitze and Jack Matlock, of course. There were a panoply of impressive intellects who said that this was a prescription for disaster. And you know what? They were right. And the end result is we are in this situation where enormous damage has already been done to Ukraine, most importantly, but to the West, to Russia, and to the United States. And with the passage of time, I'm sad to say, it's only going to get worse.
So that is unfortunately his prediction, which is that this doesn't really end, that this just marches us really into another very, very cold war with Russia, that the fighting itself will end. Russia will end up with 4 oblasts, maybe 8 oblasts, but Ukraine will be left as a rump state. But otherwise, thinking that we're going to go back to the way it was before 2022, it's just not going to happen. We're going to have this very hostile relationship with Russia. Probably you can add China to that mix soon enough. And so that's where we're at with this. And he's right. You know, Minsk, when they said, oh, well, the Minsk, you know, why would Russia say, okay, let's agree to a peace agreement when Minsk, now they've admitted, was just to buy time and that they didn't mean any of those promises? Why would Russia trust us after we've expanded NATO, after shaking their hand and saying we're not going to expand NATO? There's absolutely no trust there. So there's no reason for Russia, rightfully, to trust anything the West says. That's gone, rightfully so. The one thing, though, is that in the end, you know, he mentions the nationalism and the hyper-nationalism, and that is one of the things that Putin has said that he's fighting in Ukraine is the Nazis, right? And we've seen there's definitely nationalism, there's definitely Nazis in Ukraine. That's undeniable, for sure. But Mearsheimer is right when he says now it's worse. This didn't make the problem better. It actually made it worse. The people who were hyper-nationalist, that were pro-Ukraine, totally against Russians, because remember, the Nazism in Ukraine was really against Russians, against ethnic Russians, Russian speakers, and that's who they were targeting. Now that's worse. Western Ukraine is going to be even more so in this way. They're even more so going to hate Russians. And that is still going to be on their border. I mean, at the end of the day, Russia takes 8 oblasts. Guess who's still on their border? Ukraine. At the end of the day, that rump state of Ukraine, the Western whatever's left, decides to join NATO. Guess what's on Russia's border? Nukes in NATO. It doesn't really change that particular issue. NATO on my border, nukes on my border, Nazis on my border. Doesn't change that at the end of this. So ultimately, this is, I agree with Mearsheimer in his analysis after listening to him. I think he makes a really great point that this is really ultimately just meant to hobble Ukraine, turn it into a rump state. It's not necessarily about those other things that have been listed. This is just meant to turn it into a nothingness, essentially, a rump state. So interesting talk by Mearsheimer, very informative. He's been dead on the money previously, probably is again. So that's where we're at with that. So there you go. Well, the biggest summer secret to great looking, glowing summer skin is a lot more than just staying hydrated and using sun protection. It's having great skincare products from our friends at Genucel. Sun exposure, dehydrated skin, dark spots, even puffy bags under the eyes are a problem for all of us, but thankfully Genucel has the perfect answer. They've got this curated summer essentials package. This limited edition package includes their one-of-a-kind Ultra Retinol Super Moisturizer that uses a powerful plant extract alternative to retinol without the harsh side effects, and it's perfectly safe to use in the summer sun, which is always my big issue. I love using retinol products, but in the summer, you got to tone it down, but not when you're using Genucel's products. Plus, you're going to get Genucel's classic skincare therapy for under eye bags and puffiness and concentrated vitamin C serum to nourish your skin for a visibly clear complexion. A lot of people forget about the vitamin C. You need that vitamin C in your skincare. You're going to get this glow. It is just going to make you look really wonderful. So go to Genucel.com/Kim, and you're going to get your Genucel Summer Essentials package. And just for the summer, every subscription order includes a customized summer spa gift box, absolutely free. So again, go to Genucel.com/Kim. If you use Kim in the checkout, you're going to get a promo 10% off in addition. So go to Genucel.com/Kim or use the promo code Kim. Either way, you're going to get yourself a discount on all of these products. And they are really great products. I first was introduced to them by seeing someone with the best skin I'd ever seen. I asked her, what are you using? She says Genucel. So here we are, Genucel. All right, guys, Genucel.com/Kim. Well, there are some startling new revelations in the Julian Assange case. With us now to give us the update is attorney Richard Roth. Mr. Roth is the lead attorney in a lawsuit that seeks damages from the CIA and Mike Pompeo for spying on WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange's visitors. Now, back in November, Mike Pompeo was served and it was caught on videotape. Watch this. All right, Richard Roth, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here. So tell us first give us the background information on this case and then get to the startling new developments.
Sure. I will say the serving of Mike Pompeo was a fun idea that we had to basically serve him at an event. But here's what this is about. So the background is the following. There are several people that went into the Ecuadorian embassy. As we know, Julian Assange for close to 6 years was in the Ecuadorian embassy seeking asylum because the U.S. essentially wanted to extradite him. While he was there, it was his home. The Ecuadorians welcomed him for 6 years. He had, as you can imagine, several meetings, business meetings, meetings with journalists, meetings with lawyers, meetings with his own doctor, meetings with his girlfriend, meetings with everyone. And unbeknownst to him, a point in time came where the CIA essentially entered into an agreement with the company that was handling security of the embassy, and they imaged everyone's phone, laptop, and iPhone laptop and iPad that went in. They audio and video actually had a camera and a microphone in the conference rooms, even in the ladies' bathroom where Julian Assange spent time. And so what we learned was that all these people that went to see Julian Assange, many of whom were U.S. citizens, were wrongfully information was wrongfully taken from them in violation of the Constitution. So the people that we've spoken to literally dozens and dozens of people, and there are others waiting in the wings, but at least 4 of them, 2 of whom are lawyers, 2 of whom are journalists, said, wait a minute, I didn't know that when I was walking in to see Julian, I handed them my cell phone, that the US government would not only image everything on my phone, which violates the 4th Amendment, but would also have attorney-client protected information because I'm an attorney and I had clients, independent of Mr. Assange, just information that I had. So they were very upset about it. They learned about it, and they said, we as U.S. citizens have a right, and we want to go after the people that wrongfully took our equipment, imaged it, and violated those rights. And therein lies the 4 plaintiffs. And no one at any time said, by the way, we're imaging your computer, we're imaging your phone, but but they did. And we learned through a Spanish proceeding, there's a proceeding in Spain, in Madrid, that in or about 2017, the CIA entered into an agreement with this company called UC Global, which was a little surveillance, little monitoring company, which now is an international company, to essentially tape and watch Julian Assange during his stay. We learned all this information with the Spanish proceeding, and we said it's inappropriate. We sued the CIA, Mike Pompeo. You saw the service there. I can't get enough. I think it's hysterical. He was not happy about it. And we sued UC Global and a guy named Mr. Morales, who ran UC Global, because they wrongfully violated the constitutional rights of the American citizens. And that's essentially the background to this lawsuit. It's different than it's similar to the extent that they were wrongfully monitoring Assange, but it's different to the extent that it's a lawsuit by these individuals, not Julian Assange, against the U.S. government.
Okay, so let's just unpack that a little bit more. So this US
Sure.
Global, it's called US Global, the company that is
UC
oh, sorry,
Global.
UC
Yes,
Global.
okay.
And where are they headquartered? Are they an American company?
They are an American company. They're out of Las Vegas, and they actually met with the CIA at the Sands in Las Vegas.
And they
Actually,
were,
let me take that back. They're
yeah,
a Spanish company with offices in Las Vegas. They're actually Spanish.
okay. Okay, so they're a Spanish company. Because I'm trying to figure out, why is Spain involved?
Spain is involved because once all this was learned by the authorities, they commenced an action against UC Global Morales because they are Spanish, wondering if they in any way violated the Spanish law. So there's an entire proceeding going on in Spain, and the reason why we started this lawsuit and the proof we have, which was pretty damning before when we started the lawsuit, it's even better now. The proof we have is that there are individuals who are working at the Ecuadorian embassy for UC Global who were very uncomfortable because they knew they were violating the law. So what they did was they actually contacted people, and we have sworn affidavits from these individuals, essentially walking through everything they did, from the imaging of the phone to the imaging of the laptops to the tape recording and videotaping of Assange and the individuals. And that's what really started this whole Spanish inquiry. Why are you doing this to someone at the Ecuadorian embassy? What rights do you have to actually violate their rights? So that's where it started, all in Madrid. And what we've been doing is essentially learning information from both the Spanish courts as the Spanish proceeding, and of course the Spanish papers. El País, which is the largest paper in Madrid, has been publishing story after story after story about the development of that case. And every time they publish a story, our eyes pop, because it's just really, really wrong. The conduct of the CIA is just totally inappropriate.
So why are the Ecuadorians not involved? Are they suing this company? I mean, are they the ones that hired this company to conduct security for their embassy? So why are they going after them as well?
So they were not going after them because they hired the company for security, but we don't know if they necessarily knew that after it was hired, the company entered into a separate agreement with the CIA. And quite frankly, we don't, our case on behalf of American citizens is against the American government. Whether the Ecuadorian government did something wrong to Assange or through UC Global is really not my case.
Got it.
So we're
Okay.
saying American individuals violations by the American government. That's
Right.
my case.
Because the government, the American government, according to our Constitution, is they're not allowed to spy on Americans, home or abroad. They're not to be spying on
That's
us, correct?
correct. That's why you get
Okay.
search warrants. That's why last month
Right.
there was a search warrant for Rudy Giuliani. There was one for Donald Trump. There's one for anyone. If you want to come into my house, government, you need a judge. You have to essentially prepare documents. The court will then decide whether there's probable cause. And if the court determines there's probable cause, they will allow the police, the FBI, to go in and search things. You don't have an unfettered right just to search through anyone's belongings unless there's
Right.
probable cause or even reasonable suspicion. That's the two standards. And
So,
so the case is essentially against the government for violating those rights.
okay. So they could theoretically spy on Julian Assange, who is not an American citizen. So they could have been spying on him, and then maybe they could have gathered some information with his visitors that were arriving. But you're saying that they went beyond that and they spied on the actual visitors themselves and not just the conversations between them and Julian Assange.
That's correct. They spied on the visitors by actually taking the phones and laptops of the visitors. And even Julian Assange, think about this. The federal government has issued an indictment against Julian Assange. Julian Assange needs in Virginia is where the case will be tried if and when he's extradited. He'll probably be extradited. Julian Assange brings U.S. counsel to the Ecuadorian embassy to prepare him to defend his case against the federal government. The federal government is listening or has those tapes, the actual audio and video of Julian Assange preparing his defense against it. So
Yeah.
even if they're spying on Assange, if there are U.S. citizens in the room, particularly his own lawyers,
Yeah.
particularly in case against the government, I can't think of anything more appropriate. I mean, there's the attorney-client privilege as well as the privilege to not violate your right of privacy, and that's essentially where this comes down. So yes, they could spy on foreigners. But when Americans come into the room, his doctors, they have medical patient privilege information, which they shouldn't have.
Yeah, okay. I mean, but it's not like they're sitting over there trying to follow any rules. I mean, there was at one point they were trying to murder Julian Assange. You know, that was floated. So they seem to be willing to break all kinds of rules when it comes to him.
Well, there's that's one of the explosive things that we just learned. So Mike Pompeo, who presumably will announce his candidacy for president any day, came out with a book. I forgot the name of the book. It's in our papers that we just filed today. And he basically goes through what he was doing in certain months of certain years. In one year, I think it was 2017, on December 23rd, he was actually studying extrajudicial murders on the 23rd with his, according to him in his book, with his son and wife in the room. And that's sort of a weird thing to study. Shortly after that, we learned from Yahoo that, and again, we don't know the source, that there's at least some allegation that there was an attempt to murder Julian Assange. Now, I don't know if there's a correlation there, but I don't really believe in coincidences. So it is troublesome if the Yahoo story is the story that leaked that there was an attempt to murder Julian Assange. If it's true, we as American citizens have a problem with that. If you don't agree with him, there are processes to, assuming you're even right, lock him up. You don't assassinate someone who's literally sitting in an embassy, who's not even affiliated with a foreign country. So yeah, if in fact that's true, it's very bothersome.
Yeah. So where is this case now? I mean, at what point are you going to be dragging Mike Pompeo into court and the CIA into court?
So we started the case in August of last year. We actually amended the complaint to add some allegations in January. Every litigation, I'll be very elementary here. Every litigation has three stages. There's a pleading/motions, there's discovery, and there's trial. Once we filed the amended complaint, the federal government, CIA, and Pompeo actually made a motion to dismiss. So we're in, if you will, stage one. Today we filed papers opposing that motion to dismiss, and what the motion is based on in part is that there aren't sufficient allegations in the complaint to draw a nexus between U.S. Global and the CIA. And we said in our papers, oh, we have it, but not only do we have it, we've learned a lot since then. This last week, and so we put more information in our papers to let the court know that there's sufficient evidence to keep him in the case. So Pompeo and the CIA have made a motion. Today we filed opposition papers. Presumably, they'll put in reply papers in a month. The court will decide this motion sometime between September and December. Then stage one will essentially be over, assuming the motion is denied. We will engage in discovery, which means that if Pompeo stays in the case, we're not sure if he will, we will take his deposition. We will learn information from the CIA. We will get more information from the Spanish courts, and then we'll go to stage three, which is the trial. So we're looking at a good more than a year before trial. This is a big obstacle because there are a lot of laws in this country to preclude an individual from suing the government. And we have to, if you will, we have to overcome those burdens.
Yeah, what are those? What is that rule anyway? I've heard of this before. We've come across this where you can't sue the U.S. government. What is that called, and what is the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, there's a lot of rules. There's immunity. It makes sense. I mean, take what happened in the Agent Orange during the Vietnam era. So the government, the military, had essentially used as a weapon this compound, which was cancerous. So back then, the courts have said you can't sue the military if they wrongfully used the compound which caused cancer, Agent Orange. So since then, and even before then, it makes sense to have immunity. You don't want everyone suing the government if they do something wrong. So that does make sense. But there are some Supreme Court cases which allow you to sue the head of an agency, Pompeo, and the agency for inappropriate conduct. Our argument in our papers filed today is that this is one of those cases. The government argues that they're essentially immune from prosecution.
Got it. So this would be sovereign immunity? Do we still call it that in this country? We don't call it sovereign immunity.
Sovereign immunity is more
because that's like for the crown.
No, that's good. That's good. That's good, Kim. I mean, yes, actually, it's a sovereign immunity. It's immunity from prosecution by a citizen, which generally does make sense. I mean, there's enough litigation in our country to, feed a lot of people, including me. But so there should be limitations on lawsuits. This is an instance where if they engage in such gross misconduct, that shouldn't apply.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how I guess I understand your reasoning to some degree that maybe the government shouldn't be able to be sued, but I don't know. I kind of think they should be able to be sued all the time. I think we'd have to discuss that and flesh that out more for me to agree that they should have immunity in certain circumstances. I'd have to really look at what case that would be. But at this point, I'm thinking,
there's a lot.
Well, they do.
It's not just immunity. I mean, they argued essentially that that there was no violation of Fourth Amendment rights, that there's no right that when you're in an embassy, you don't have a right to privacy, which we dispute.
Really?
They argue you can't get an injunction. They throw a bunch of barriers at us. And we, like bowling pins, we try to, not that I'm a good bowler, but I'm a good lawyer. So we try to knock them down one at a time. There's several pins they threw at us. And we are arguing against each and every one of them, one of which is we don't have enough evidence. And boy, do we have evidence.
Interesting. Well, so this is all for just the visitors for the Ecuadorian embassy. This is not for Belmarsh prison. We don't know. I mean, I don't think he's been able to have very many visitors while he's been actually held at Belmarsh. Do you just have any update on him or his condition or anything at all?
I do. He has had much fewer at Belmarsh, but that's where the argument would apply. There is no right to privacy when someone's in prison. You have to know when you go to someone's prison that there's microphones all over the place. They have a right to tape whatever you want. So he has been in Belmarsh. He's, I understand, doing okay. I mean, he doesn't look great. He's been in, think about it, in 2012, I think it was, he went into the embassy and he was there till 2000, I want to say 19. And then in 19 to now, he's been in Belmarsh 10 years. He's been in some kind of confinement. So I heard he's doing okay. We don't know what's going to happen. Presumably he'll be they will send him to the U.S. and there will be a trial in the U.S. and there will be presumably a groundswell of support for an investigative reporter, which is all he is.
Yeah.
And if I can, the reason why the news is today is not the news is so hot today, if you will, is not only because we filed our papers opposing the motion, but more importantly, this week El País, the paper I mentioned earlier in Madrid, came out with more stories about what they've learned in the Spanish proceeding, and the CIA's argument against the my clients is that we couldn't draw a nexus between UC Global and the CIA. El País this week essentially looked at 250 gigabytes of data, and they found in UC Global's computers CIA files, and they're
Ah,
scouring through those. Think about that. If the CIA has nothing to do with UC Global,
yeah.
why is there a CIA file in UC Global? I don't have a CIA file on my computer.
Me
So,
neither. I have to
so
check though. Maybe.
maybe they have my information, but I
Yeah,
don't have theirs.
right.
But the point is that if in fact there are these documents, communications, presumably instructions, presumably all other things in the US UC Global files from or about the CIA, it leads me to, at least scratch my head and say why. So
Yeah.
that's what we're learning, and that's what El País is now disclosing almost on a weekly basis. They're learning more and more because there's a tremendous trove of information that was provided to the courts, and the press is just going through it.
Wow. Wow. I know that you're not the attorney for Julian Assange specifically, but I'm curious why, in my mind, as you mentioned, you just brought up that when he gets extradited to the United States, that there should be a groundswell and people will come forward and say, hey, wait a minute, this is wrong. We cannot be doing this because it's a threat to all journalists, all publishers. Why do you, in my mind, I agree with you. I do think that once he's here and the trial begins, that every publisher in the country will have to come forward and say, this is going to be a problem for us. So you have to let him go. You have to, or, he can't be found guilty for this. Why have they not just chosen to extradite him sooner? Why do they keep fighting the extradition? Because that to me seems like his best shot at freedom.
The concern on his behalf, I don't represent him, but I'm familiar with it. The concern on his behalf is that the court in Virginia that he is going to be tried is a very conservative court, and that is a very risky, he could lose. And if he loses, he goes to jail for life. So the thought is to fight the extradition. If you win, I don't see it happening, but if they win, then he won't be extradited, he won't be tried. So it's another, if you will, layer of defense to not have him tried in Virginia. But as far as the groundswell of support and why it hasn't really happened yet, I believe two things. One, I believe that people in this country don't really know what happened, what Julian Assange disclosed. They don't know that Julian Assange received information like any reporter. It's just not out there. And what he
Right.
disclosed is not current secrets. He disclosed things that the military did. So if the press gets that information, whether it's the New York Times, it's Fox News, CNN, not only can they, but they have an obligation to tell the world. So that's number one. And number two is that the concern that we're going to have, well, reporters have, is that does a reporter, every time it gets information, have to say, wait a minute, if I disclose it, am I in trouble? The New York Times got Donald Trump's tax returns. Do they have to not disclose it because
Right.
it's wrong? So this whole country is based on the concept that there's an inherent conflict between the government and the freedom of the press, and to essentially say the press has to think twice about publishing something, it's a very scary proposition, and that I think will come out more and more if in fact he comes to the U.S. But he still has the risk of losing a trial.
Yeah, for sure. But I think that would cause a major uproar here in the United States. I think publishers would finally have to pay attention. Journalists would have to pay attention. A lot of it right now, it's like out of sight, out of mind. But I think when he's here, that could definitely, I think, change things for him for sure. And it wouldn't be good enough for him to be convicted and then pardoned by the sitting president at the time, because that means the crime would still be on the books as a crime, and that would be problem. That would be the problem for journalists and publishers. It has to be combated somehow prior to that point, saying, well, during the trial, it would have to be combated and argued successfully that publishing is not a crime. That's what would have to. That's what's on trial, truly. So
And
people
it's
don't seem to
and
understand that.
you are so right, and it's such a fundamental concept, and it's really startling a person of the press, that's all he is. He didn't work
Yeah.
for the federal government. He didn't steal information. If a person of the press is on trial, it just goes against everything that this country stands for. And I think there will be a huge groundswell of support.
Yeah.
And I think you give example after example after example. You pick a news source, and I will give you a dozen examples where they get information, whether it's Watergate, whether it's, I could go on and on and on. They get information. It's their obligation to disclose it.
Yeah.
So we don't really want to get there. Certainly Assange doesn't want to get there,
Sure.
because when you're on trial, who knows what's going to happen. But it will be quite a newsworthy event if he comes to Virginia and if he's tried.
Richard, thank you so much for joining us tonight. So where can people find more information or follow this case? Besides, of course, I'll be covering it, but beyond that, is there somewhere people can go, or is it just you'll kind of inform us as we get more pieces?
Yeah, so listen, any reporters that are watching, anyone's interested, you can always email me, rich@rrothlaw.com. You could always Google it and look at it. It's in the Southern District of New York, the case. It's called Margaret Kunstler's, Kunstler, and Deborah Erbeck against Pompeo, CIA. I think Assange also has his website. It's like freejulianassange.org or something like that, which I know was mentioned in a prior discussion I had today. And so there's a lot out there, and like you said, out of sight, out of mind. The closer this gets to being real, the more attention this is going to get.
Yeah. Well, let's give it some attention. So thank you, Richard. Thanks for joining us.
Kim, thank you for having me.
Well, we all know that our currency is perhaps crashing soon. Will no longer be the standard, which is not going to be the best thing in the world. So what can you do about it? Maybe you want to diversify your assets, diversify your investments into gold, because the fact is there is one asset that has withstood famine, wars, political and economic upheaval, dating all the way back to biblical times, and that is gold. And you can own it in a tax-sheltered retirement account with the help of Birch Gold. That's right, Birch Gold will help you convert an existing IRA or 401k, maybe from a previous employer, into an IRA in gold. And the best part, you don't have to pay a penny out of pocket. Just visit birchgold.com/Kim for your free info kit. They're going to hold your hand through the entire process. So think about this. When currencies fail, gold is a safe haven. How much more time does the dollar have? So protect your savings with gold. Birch Gold has an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, thousands of happy customers. Just visit birchgold.com/Kim to get your free info kit on gold. Again, visit birchgold.com/Kim. Okay, yesterday, I think it was yesterday afternoon, Tucker Carlson actually unveiled his new show on Twitter. So he made this announcement a while ago that he was going to be, when he was fired from Fox, he made the announcement that he was going to be doing a show on Twitter. Elon Musk came out and said, I have nothing to do with this. Tucker's free to do what he wants, and he's welcome here. We'd love to have him. Well, last night, he actually rolled out his first episode. Here's just a little clip.
As of today, we've come to Twitter, which we hope will be the shortwave radio under the blankets. We're told there are no gatekeepers here. If that turns out to be false, we'll leave. But in the meantime, we are grateful to be here. We'll be back with much more very soon.
So it was a very different episode. It was just him talking in that room. And then there was some footage. There wasn't the fancy Fox kind of graphics and none of that stuff. And it's a little echoey. He might work on his audio a little bit, but all in all, we'll see. I mean, he hasn't announced a schedule. We don't know how often he's going to be doing this. Not sure if this is something he's doing while he's still dealing with his contract with Fox. It's very possible that he's allowed to do social media videos without breaking his contract to Fox, which is maybe why he's doing a show on Twitter. Because from my experience of negotiating these talent deals with big companies is that a lot of times they carve out that they want you to be doing stuff on social media and they don't oversee it. And so it could be the case. They might have made a carve out for like YouTube, saying you can't be on YouTube and making money because we own the rights to put your clips on YouTube. You cannot do that. They may have had those carve outs these contracts get really, really complicated. So it's really possible that they said, but social media, please do it. Do what you want on social media. That's all yours. The more, the merrier. And he might have looked at this contract and said, okay, well, if I can go on Twitter and they say more the merrier in this contract, it doesn't break my Fox deal, then I could potentially go and do a show on Twitter. Now, some people are saying, now I don't know the details of that, by the way. I'm just speculating based on the talent deals I've done in the past with corporate media entities like iHeartRadio and whatnot. So so now people are looking at Tucker's show. Now, remember on Fox News, Tucker got 3 million, on average, about 3 million viewers, 3.5 million viewers per night. This is how many he got on this video. So a lot of people are saying Twitter is the place to be. 85.7 million views on this video so far. I'm sure it's more, growing every minute, but 85.7 million. So I want to point something out though, because people are saying, wow, 3 million on Fox, but 85 million on Twitter. This is the way. So I looked back at the data from videos that I've posted on Twitter. I don't post many, but here's one from when I interviewed Alan Dershowitz, and I put this clip on Twitter, and you could see this one has 221,000 views, okay? Not 85 million by any means, but 221,000 views. Okay, let's go to the analytics. Now, I can't go to the analytics on Tucker's, but I can show you the back-end analytics on mine so that you can kind of understand how these video views work, because he didn't really get 85 million views. So this one shows the 222,000 impressions. Now, what does that mean? Impressions mean that's how many people just saw it on their Twitter feed as it scrolled by. So it doesn't mean you stop to watch it. It's just how many times did it show up on someone's Twitter feed? Okay, but how many, when you get a Twitter, you just scroll, 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 but that's just how many times. Now let's go to the actual views of the video, because they show that number, that impressions. That's what they show when you're looking at, when you scroll and it'll say 220,000 views and you're thinking, wow, it's a lot, but it's not. That's views, but not views of the video. So this is what the unique views are, 50,000 unique views of the video. So that's a lot less than 222, right? It's 50. So that's the unique views. Then it looks like 10,000 people or so watched it twice, right? Now you look at the audience retention, and this is the number of those people, of the 50,000 unique views, who actually watched the video all the way to the bitter end. And in mine, that clip there, that Alan Dershowitz clip was 2 minutes and 5 seconds, 3% watched that video to the bitter end. So that is 6,000 people. So that's a lot less than 222,000, right? 6,000 is who actually watched it all the way to the end. Now that's in the world of advertising and whatnot. You don't need somebody to watch or stick around all the way to the bitter end, but that just goes to show, people are going to trail off after a couple of minutes or something. So here's another video that I did recently. This one was when I was talking about Crystal's interview with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. I want to show you this one because this one has 85,000 views. So this is not million, not 85 million, but 85,000, so that we can kind of break the numbers down to how many people most likely watched Tucker's video. So let's go to the breakdown of the numbers here. So 85,000 impressions. Now let's go to the actual numbers. You've got 28,000 unique views of the video. Now this video had an audience retention a 3%. I'm sorry, the Dershowitz one had 12% that watched it all the way to the bitter end. So sorry about my math on that. 12% watched all the way to the bitter end. That's how I got the 6,000 people watched the Dershowitz video. This one, the viewer retention was lower. It was 3% to the bitter end. That means out of 28,000 people, 3%, 840 people watched that particular clip that was on Twitter to the bitter end. Those numbers, 6,000 people watching Dershowitz, 840 people watching this Crystal and RFK Jr. video, that is a much, much lower viewership than I get on YouTube or Rumble. Much, 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 significantly lower. So Twitter is still not at that point yet. But if we let's just say we take this 85,000, we add some zeros to it, right, for Tucker's, and you're looking at Tucker Carlson getting, if he got a 3% retention rate, 840,000 people watched his video to the end. If he got a 12% retention rate, then that would be about 2.8 million people watched it to the bitter end. That's pretty good. If he can get, which I would imagine Tucker has a higher retention rate. That would be my guess. His might even be higher than 12%. So it might have just rivaled the actual numbers he gets on Fox News at 3 million. And that's pretty damn good. He made a lot of money getting 3 million viewers a night. But there were a lot of advertisers, in an hour-long show. You're packing it full of tons of advertisers. You got several commercial breaks. Each commercial break has several commercials. That's a lot of money. He also has a much larger staff and an entire operation and corporate suits that you got to pay. So you can scale a lot of that down, have only a couple of advertisers per segment, still get those 3-4 million views and make quite a bit of money. Not sure if it goes all the way to Fox News level money, but maybe. So we'll see how he does. But I just wanted to break down the numbers because a lot of people are looking at it and saying 85 million views. Oh my gosh, this is way bigger than Fox. And I'm just showing it doesn't necessarily break down that way. So just so you know how it works on Twitter. All right, guys. Before we go, we do have to also pay some bills. So we're going to talk commercials here. Our great sponsor, Field of Greens. Field of Greens is a product that I really do love. It is a fine powder made from dehydrated whole fruits and vegetables that are carefully selected to give you the most nutrients in your diet possible. So all you do is you just take this scoop of powder, mix it into your ice water or your iced tea. It actually tastes really delicious, and this is an easy way to get all of your fruits and vegetables into your diet. I personally really like the lemon lime flavor. Mix it up. It's like green tea with lemon, and it's got that tea consistency. It's watery. They also have a mixed berry flavor. They have an energy version. They've got regular. So all kinds of choices for you. I really like it mixed into iced tea or water, but you can mix this into broths and drink it like a soup or put it in your salad dressings, bake it into brownies. Lots of ways you could do this. Great way to get those fruits and vegetables into your diet. So head to fieldofgreens.com, use the promo code Kim, and you're going to get 15% off your first order. A lot of products there, not just this Field of Green powder, but they've got other products there. Anything you get, you can get 15% off your first order by using that promo code Kim. All right, guys, that is it for tonight's show. Thank you so much for joining. I do appreciate getting your emails on your thoughts on the show. You can go to kim@kimiverson.com, and that's how you can email me. Any of your thoughts, I appreciate it. I like your suggestions on topics, guests, any of those things. But we will be back tomorrow night, same time, same place at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern with another great show. Until then, have a great night.